Richard Lawson sat quietly at a table in one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, surrounded by the soft lights and soft music, but his heart was heavy. The symbolic warning of the beggar woman and the thirsty child he had seen yesterday was still clear. He had given her $350, hoping that the money would help them through a night of thirst. But in the morning he had seen the woman placing flowers at the grave of an old lover of his, who had died 23 years earlier, leaving him with a difficult and inexplicable sense of connection. Richard Lawson slowed his pace, his eyes fixed on the young woman sitting in front of Emily's headstone. The remaining raindrops on the leaves fell onto the cold gray stone floor, blending with Richard's heavy breathing. The image was like a piece of the club that did not fit into the broken picture of his life. Before him, the young woman, Sophie, seemed to carry a secret he had never suspected. As he met Sophie's eyes, Richard felt his heart heavy. He had lost Emily for more than 2 decades, and during that time, the pain of loneliness had not ceased to torment him. But this young woman, with her deep eyes, seemed to open a door to memories he had never thought he would find again. Emily is my mother. Sophie's words still echoed in his head, repeating over and over again like a word he could not forget. Richard suddenly remembered those months with Emily. They had both dreamed of a happy future, but Emily had never mentioned having children. He had thought they would forever be 2 lonely travelers in the sea of fate. Yet now before him was a girl who said she was the daughter of the only woman he had ever loved deeply. Sophie did. Emily ever want to tell me this? Richard's voice was dull, his eyes never leaving the girl's face. He longed for an explanation, a reason why his life was no longer just a wound that would never heal. Sophie turned her head, her hands clasping the child in her arms, her eyes becoming dull. "I don't know," she answered, her voice lonely and commercial but also sad. "Mother never told me about him. It was only when she died that I found the letters she had written but never sent. Those letters were all I knew about him." Richard fell silent. He imagined Emily sitting alone, writing letters to him but never sending them. He felt trapped in a dream where the pieces of the past fell around him, never quite complete. "Table, how did you know about this grave?" he asked, the fact lurking in the words. Sophie gently pointed to an old piece of paper she had carefully placed beside the grave. "She wrote your name on it and this address. She wanted to come here, but she was never sure. Come when I knew I could. I didn't hold back, because I needed to understand the man my mother loved so much." Richard looked down at the paper, his eyes wavering between reality and dream. Sophie was not just a shadow of Emily but a piece of his own soul, a part of the love he had thought he had lost forever. "Sophie," he said, each word heavy, "I can't imagine this feeling. I've lived so long in the darkness of loss, and now you're like a light coming through a small crack in the door, shining into a place I thought I could never feel." Sophie smiled softly, her eyes sad but warm. "I understand," she said. "I didn't come here to ask anything. I just want to know that my mother loved me, and that I was never alone in my journey to find my roots." Richard stood frozen at Sophie's confession, his mind still filled with unanswered questions. Sophie's words were like a knife stabbing deep into his heart, stirring up emotions that had long been buried. He had thought he knew everything about Emily, the wife he had loved and adored for the past 20 years, but now the truth had just been revealed, shattering everything. A gentle breeze blew by, carrying the scent of grass and the sound of rustling leaves. Sophie looked down at the child in her arms, softly saying, "Daniel is my son, and your grandson." Her voice was an echo from the distant past, carrying a hint of trepidation and certainty. Richard looked into her eyes, and for the first time he saw a familiar light in them, the eyes of Emily, the wife he had loved. "But why? Why didn't Emily tell me?" Richard asked, his voice breaking. The question rang through the air, carrying resentment, disbelief, and deep sadness. Richard couldn't understand, couldn't accept that Emily had kept this great secret for so many years. The happy moments with her were now overshadowed by things he had never known. "I don't know," Sophie replied, her eyes looking down, as if to avoid his pained gaze. "I only found out who my mother was a few months ago, and I spent a lot of time piecing together the truth. When I learned she was gone, I knew this was the only place I could find answers." Richard took a deep breath, trying to find some semblance of support amid the chaotic emotions swirling through his mind. He looked at Sophie, at the child in her arms, feeling a fragile glimmer of hope creeping through the pain. This child, Daniel, was what was left of Emily, an unexpected but meaningful connection. For him, it was like a door opening to things he had never thought of. "I don't know what to do next," Richard said, his voice sounding faint in the vastness of the cemetery. A sense of loss welled up inside him, but also curiosity, a desperate need to understand. He looked at Daniel, his heart pounding as he realized that in this child he had the chance to hold a part of Emily again, to redeem some of the past that had slipped through his fingers. Sophie looked at him, her eyes shining with empathy and determination. "I don't ask anything from you," she said softly but firmly. "I just want to know who my mother was. I think you deserve to know the truth about her, about me, and about Daniel." Richard nodded, his eyes lingering on Emily's headstone. Memories flooded back, of the afternoons he stood silently in front of this grave, talking to her in silence, trying to come to terms with the fact that she was gone. But now, with Sophie and Daniel, the peace he thought he had found was gone. In that moment he realized that his life had been changed forever. There was no way to go back, but maybe this was his chance to start a new chapter, one where he could better understand Emily, the life he thought he knew. Richard took a step towards Sophie and Daniel, feeling his heart slowly open to something new. Even though the past was intertwined with unspoken secrets, he realized that the future could offer him a chance to build something new, something better than he had ever dreamed. Richard stood silently in the room, the cold wind blowing in from the half-closed window, carrying raindrops on his face. In front of him was Emily's diary, the lines of slanted writing running down the old pages, a part of his memory that he had never thought to explore. The pain in his chest still ached as he reread the lines filled with fear and helplessness from Emily, the wife he once believed he understood. But it turned out that Emily also had hidden corners that he did not know, fears that she kept hidden to protect him. The last words in the diary were like a deep cut into his soul. "He cannot understand. I cannot let him see me weak like this. He deserves a good future, not a future burdened by my mistakes." Richard felt heavy. Why did she think that keeping Sophie a secret was the best thing for both of them? Why did she not trust that he would understand and accept this? Before meeting Sophie, Richard had accepted that Emily was gone forever, taking with her all the dreams they had promised to fulfill together. But now, with the presence of Sophie and Daniel, the feeling of a family he had never had the chance to know became more real than ever. The baby in Sophie's arms was a part of him, his bloodline, Emily's legacy, and that made his heart ache. Sophie stood there, her eyes gentle and hopeful, but also mixed with anxiety and hesitation. "I didn't come here to ask anything from you," she said softly, her gaze sweeping over Daniel's sleeping face. "I just want to know the truth, to learn about my origins and then be able to move on with peace of mind." Sophie's words made Richard suddenly realize that, despite losing Emily, he still had the chance to not only connect with his daughter but also to repair what had been missed in the past. He couldn't let Sophie leave with the sadness and emptiness he'd felt. He had to take this chance, to fix what was broken, to rebuild some part of the life Emily had dreamed of. Son, Richard hesitated, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't know where to start, but I want to try. I want to know more about you, about Daniel. If you're willing, we can start here, even if it's not easy." Sophie looked into his eyes, hers struggling. But then she nodded, smiling slightly. "I want that too. We can try. But it will take time for both of us to get to know each other better." Richard felt a vague joy, as if he had recovered a part of himself. He could never forget Emily, but now he could continue the journey she had left, with Sophie and Daniel. Richard leaned back in his chair, feeling heavy. His thoughts were racing through what he had just read in Emily's diary. It wasn't just the betrayal of hiding Sophie from him, it was the fear of how he would react, fear of the life-changing revelation that would result. Perhaps, in some hidden corner of her mind, Emily had tried to protect him from the pain she herself had not dared to face. Now, the consequences of that decision weighed heavily. Sophie had grown up without knowing her father, and Richard had missed the chance to be a part of her life. Thinking about Daniel, his newly discovered nephew, only made his mind more turbulent. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the choices Emily had made. But perhaps Richard realized he could still move forward. The next morning, Richard decided to take the initiative. He remembered his promise to Sophie, his promise to try, and now he wanted to keep it. Anxiety gripped him, but he knew that maintaining his connection to Sophie and Daniel was something he did not want to give up. Richard picked up the phone, hesitantly dialing the number Sophie had left. After a few rings, her soft but firm voice came through. "Hello," Sophie answered. "Sophie, it's me," Richard, he began, his voice trembling slightly. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I think we need to talk." There was a moment of silence, his heart stopping, afraid that she might refuse. But then Sophie spoke, softly but firmly. "Yes, I think we should talk." At their next meeting, they chose a quiet corner of a small cafe, tucked away from the noise of the city. Richard arrived early, sat down, his hand reflexively adjusting his collar. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had read in Emily's diary, the words that had brought him closer to her, but also made his heart ache. When Sophie walked in with Daniel in her arms, she immediately recognized Richard, who approached with a calm but cautious expression. "Thank you for coming to see me," she said softly, sitting down across from him. Richard nodded, trying to contain his emotions. "Of course," he said, his voice a little choked up. Looking down at Daniel, the child looked at him with wide, curious eyes. "How is he?" Sophie smiled softly, stroking Daniel's hair. "He's very strong, growing fast." A moment of silence passed between them, neither of them seeming to know where to start this conversation. Richard cleared his throat, deciding to get straight to the point. "I've thought a lot about what you said, and I found something that might help you understand why Emily hid you." Sophie raised her eyebrows, her eyes curious but reserved. "What did you find?" Richard hesitated for a moment, then pulled Emily's diary from his coat pocket and pushed it toward Sophie. "I found this. It's your mother's diary from the last year of her life. She wrote about her worries, her fears, and why she hid you." Sophie stared at the diary, her fingers lightly brushing the cover but not opening it. "She wrote about you?" Richard nodded. "She didn't mention you directly, but she was clearly afraid of how Dad would react, afraid that you would disrupt our lives. She thought hiding you was a way to protect Dad." Sophie's eyes softened. She placed her hand on the diary, then withdrew it. "All my life, I've wondered why my mother didn't need me. Now that I hear this, I don't know how to feel." Richard leaned forward, his eyes searching for understanding from her. "It's not that she doesn't need you, Sophie. I believe she's just lost, not knowing how to face things. But that doesn't mean she doesn't love you." Sophie took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping. "I used to think that when I found out why my mother abandoned me, everything would be clear. But now I just feel more confused." Richard nodded, understanding her feelings. "I know this isn't easy, but I think we can only choose to face the present." Amidst the mixed emotions, Richard took Sophie's hand, the warmth of his palm passing into hers, like a promise to get through it with her. Richard sat silently in the dark living room, staring at the whiskey in his hand as thoughts of Sophie in the past swirled in his mind. It had been a few days since he had last seen Sophie, but he had tried to hold back, not wanting to put pressure on her. The delicate balance between respecting her boundaries and holding on to the slim chance of connecting with her was unsettling. One moment too soon and she could leave him forever, but if he didn't try, this chance might slip away. Suddenly, his phone vibrated, pulling him from his thoughts. The message from Sophie was brief, but it contained so much. "Can we talk tomorrow?" "There's something I need to tell you." Richard's heart stopped for a moment, his mind racing with thoughts. Maybe it was about Daniel, or about Emily, a missing piece that could help him make sense of things. The next morning, Richard and Sophie met in a park near her apartment. Daniel lay quietly in his stroller, while Sophie stood still, her eyes filled with worry. When Richard approached, she smiled, but the smile could not hide the tension in her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice soft but filled with worry. Richard sat down next to her, his eyes full of encouragement. "What's wrong, Sophie?" They sat facing a peaceful lake, its surface reflecting the clear blue sky, but the air between them was heavy with unspoken words. Sophie took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, her voice a whisper, as if afraid her words would disturb the peaceful atmosphere around them. "About Dad, about Mom, about Daniel. And there's something I've never told you." Richard held his breath, keeping his face calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension rising inside him. "You can tell me anything, Sophie? Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." Sophie nodded, her eyes distantly focused on the lake, her voice trailing off into a confession. "I've always wondered why my mother didn't tell him about me. I used to think maybe she didn't want to bother him, or that he might react badly. But recently I found something that might explain why." She pulled a small, old piece of paper from her pocket, the lines faded with time, and handed it to Richard. As he read each line Emily left, he felt a pain in his heart that was hard to describe. "Richard, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write. I'm pregnant and I'm scared. I know you said you didn't want children, and I respect that. I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to put a responsibility on you that you never wanted." The words seared into Richard's mind. He was filled with horror as he realized that Emily had kept this secret out of fear of hurting him because of a fleeting word he didn't even remember. Pain flooded him as he realized that over the years he had lost not only the wife he loved, but the life they could have built together. "I can't believe it," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. "He never really wanted to be without me. Maybe he said it when he was younger, but he never thought it would be the final decision." Sophie placed her hand on his, a silent encouragement, but also a reminder of the present. "I think she was just afraid of losing you, Richard. She chose to keep this secret because she loved you." Richard bowed his head, tears glistening on his face, carrying with them an indelible regret. But when he looked up, into Sophie and Daniel's eyes, he knew that there was another chance waiting, a chance to make up for the losses he could never fully compensate for. "I don't want to waste any more time," he said, his voice firm though his eyes were still wet. "I want to be a part of your and Daniel's lives. We'll find a way together." Sophie smiled, a small smile that held hope and forgiveness. They sat silently together, saying nothing more, because they both knew that a new chapter had begun, even if there were many difficulties ahead. In the days that followed, Richard was lost in memories and thoughts, and every time he looked at Emily's letter, he felt his heart ache. Emily's words were not just words on paper, but also wounds that could not be healed in his heart. However, he also knows that now he is no longer alone. Sophie and Daniel are the present, the hope for him to continue walking, for him to do the right thing that he once missed. Richard sat silently, his eyes glued to the letter with its trembling words. His heart seemed to stop as the name James Porter appeared before his eyes. James, his old friend, a part of his past that he thought he had buried, now hidden among memories and regrets. Richard's mind was hazy, as if caught in a storm of emotions both bitter and heavy. How could James be related to Emily, the woman he once loved, the woman who had kept Sophie a secret for so many years? Sophie sat silently beside him, her eyes following every expression on Richard's face. It seemed that she too felt the heaviness of this moment, each word in the letter carrying unspoken emotions, torment, feelings that had been hidden for so long. "I know this is a shock to you," Sophie said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to deal with this. When I found the letter, I wondered if I should show it to you, but I think you deserve to know." Richard still couldn't take his eyes off the letter. James's words seemed to awaken a past in him, a part of his life that he had forgotten or tried to forget. "James and your mother," he whispered, as if talking to himself, trying to put together a picture he had never seen clearly. It was a pang of pain to think that Emily, the woman he had spent his life loving and forgiving, had a part of her life that he had never known. He had not only lost Emily, but a relationship that he had probably never truly understood. "I'm not sure what this means," but Sophie paused, searching for the right words. "I think we all have a right to know the truth, no matter how painful it is." Richard looked at Sophie, seeing determination mixed with hurt in her eyes. Perhaps she had grown up with the feeling that there was a secret hidden in this family, a truth that had never been revealed. For her, discovering this secret was not only a way to clarify her mother's past, but also a way for her to understand more about herself and her family that she had never truly known. Richard took a deep breath, putting the letter down. He reached for Sophie's hand, holding it tightly as if to reassure himself and also to convey his warmth, his presence in her life. "I'm sorry I wasn't there in your life from the beginning," he said, his voice quiet, but sincere. "I missed so many moments, so many truths. But now I want to make it right. No matter how many secrets there are, I'll be here, by your side." Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. She nodded slightly, and in that moment they both seemed to feel that, although the past might be full of pain and secrets, they still had a chance to build a future with truths that were accepted and respected. Richard leaned back in his chair, still holding Sophie's hand, feeling a sense of relief despite the chaos. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. Facing his past, facing Emily through James' old letters, would be a great challenge. But he also realized that, in the end, opening up and sharing the truth was the only way for him to move forward with Sophie. That afternoon, father and daughter sat in the peaceful space of the small apartment. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, creating an unusually warm atmosphere. Richard knew that, from this moment on, he would no longer be a distant father, but a companion, a sharer, a person ready to accept all the complexities of life that Sophie brought. Sophie stood quietly, walked to the bookshelf, and took out a small box that Richard had not noticed before. She brought it back and placed it on the long table between them. After a moment of silence, Sophie gently opened the lid and said, her eyes cautious, "There is a letter among Mother's letters, but it is not from Mother." Her voice faltered slightly. "I think. It is from someone else. You know who?" Richard, with a sharp pang in his heart, took the letter from Sophie. The name James Porter at the end of the letter surprised him. His throat tightened. It was an old friend from their youth, someone who had been very close before life had taken them in different directions. The letter, clearly addressed to Emily, revealed James's sincere and tormented words, revealing a secret love he had never known about. Richard held the letter, his hands shaking as he tried to control his emotions. He sat down, filled with anger and disbelief. Sophie placed a warm hand on his shoulder, her eyes sad and sympathetic. "I know this is hard for you," she said softly. "I've been thinking about telling you for a long time. But I think you deserve to know the truth." Richard's heart shattered as he read the letter. "Emily, I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to send this to you, but I need to write it to find some peace. I know we've kept this from you for so long, but it's weighing on me more than ever." James's letter was filled with regret and remorse. Richard took a deep breath, his eyes leaving the letter and turning to Sophie, looking for comfort. "I can't believe this," he muttered, almost in a whisper. Sophie understood that Richard needed time to process his storm. She didn't want to impose any advice. Richard stood up and paced around the small living room, trying to piece together old memories, moments with Emily, with James, for some sign he might have missed. Finally, when the pain was too much for him to handle on his own, Richard decided to confront James. The next morning, after searching for James's contact information, he sat at the table and dialed the number with a heavy heart. The phone rang, and a familiar but aged voice answered. "Hello? James, this is Richard Lawson." Richard's voice was strained, carrying the weight of hurt and anger. On the other end, James was silent for a long moment, then replied in a slightly trembling voice, "Richard. Long time no see." "Yes," Richard gritted out, trying to keep his composure despite the turmoil in his heart. "I need to talk to you. About Emily." Again, a heavy silence filled the space between them. When James finally spoke, his voice was low, almost choked with guilt. "I didn't think you'd ever know." Richard clenched his jaw, feeling like his whole world was collapsing. "So, it's true?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You and Emily, it's true?" James sighed heavily, his confession sounding like a painful release. "Yes, but it wasn't a love affair like you thought. It was much more complicated than that." Richard almost roared. "Complicated? Is that all you can say? I trusted you, James. You're my best friend." On the other end of the line, James didn't respond right away. When he spoke again, his voice was full of regret. "Richard, I never meant to hurt you, and I'm sure Emily didn't either. What happened between us was a mistake, but it wasn't what you imagined." But these words did nothing to ease Richard's pain. He hung up, feeling as if he had been beaten down. Back home, he sat there, his eyes empty as he thought about all the years he had spent trusting Emily, trusting James's friendship. Sophie moved closer, gently sitting down beside him. "I know this is hard to get over," she said, her voice full of sympathy. "But we have to find a way to move on, Richard. Maybe it will take time." Richard sighed, staring into space. "I don't want to lose you, Sophie," he whispered, his voice choked, as if searching for support. "No matter how much everything we know has changed, I don't want this to keep us apart." Sophie smiled, her eyes shining with understanding. "You're not going to lose me, Richard. I'll always be here with you." In that moment, amidst the pain and anguish, Richard found a glimmer of hope, a new hope to start over. Though the wound would never heal, he knew he still had Sophie. Richard took a deep breath, looking into Sophie's warm eyes, trying to contain the emotions that were surging inside him. He knew that the road to get here had not been easy. His life had taken many turns, many secrets and mistakes. But now, in the peaceful setting of the park, as Daniel smiled and watched the ducks swim in the lake, Richard felt a rare sense of peace, as if he had found something to hold on to, something more important than any pain from the past. "I didn't expect things to turn out like this," Richard said, his voice low, his eyes never leaving Daniel, who was happily kicking his legs on his mother's lap. "I thought the truth would free me from the pain. But it turned out that it only brought new questions, things that made me even more confused." Sophie smiled softly, her hand gently placed on his shoulder, transmitting the comfort he had always wanted. "Sometimes the truth isn't what we need most," she replied softly. "Sometimes it's important to be able to face the past, understand it, and learn to accept it. Not to find closure, but to find a way forward." Richard looked at her intently, his heart beating faster. Her words were like a ray of light penetrating his soul, soothing the wounds that seemed to have been deeply ingrained in his heart. He didn't need to try to forget or erase the past, he just needed to learn to live with it, and from there move on. "Have you always been this strong?" Sophie, Richard asked softly, a small smile on his lips. He couldn't help but wonder why she was so understanding and tolerant. Perhaps it was her patience and love that had become the driving force for him to overcome the darkness. Sophie laughed softly, her eyes sparkling like the afternoon sunlight reflecting on the surface of a lake. "I was also uncertain. Even when Daniel was born, I was still struggling to figure out how to be a mother, how to be a good enough person for my child. But then I realized that maybe just being with the person you love, spending the most genuine moments together, that's the most important thing." Richard felt his heart soften. Amidst all the hurt and pain, he felt lucky to still have Sophie and Daniel by his side. This made him realize that no matter what the past was, he still had the right to decide how he lived his present and future. "I'm so grateful to have you and Daniel in my life," Richard said, his voice low but not hiding his sincerity. "I know I've made a lot of mistakes, and there are many things I wish I could change, but the most important thing right now is being with you and Daniel." Sophie nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "We all have a past, Richard, but it's the present that helps us build our future. As long as Dad is here, with me and Daniel, I believe that everything will get better." A gentle breeze blew by, carrying the gentle scent of flowers in the park. Richard leaned back in his chair, letting the wind caress his face. In that moment, he realized that he was no longer haunted by secrets and hurts. Instead, he found himself gradually learning to let go, finding peace and true value in living in the present. That afternoon, when the three of them left the park, Richard felt lighter than ever. He held Sophie's hand, walking steadily, as if each step was a step closer to the peace he had always longed for. Sophie smiled, her hand gently squeezing his, giving him a comfort that no words could describe. That night, after putting Daniel to sleep, Richard and Sophie sat together in the living room, not saying much, simply feeling each other's presence. A strange peace filled the air, filling the void that had been haunted by pain and secrets. "Thank you," Sophie, Richard said, his voice as soft as a breeze. "Thank you for always being here, for giving me the chance to start over, to be a better father." Sophie just nodded, her eyes shining with quiet happiness. "We all deserve a second chance, Richard, and I believe you will know how to make it the best for yourself and for the people you love." Richard gently rested his head on her shoulder, closed his eyes, let their breaths blend together, like a promise that no matter what, they would always be together, overcoming all the challenges of life. In the following days, Richard still felt his heart waver a little when he remembered James's words. But now, he had a solid support, a source of strength to face the hurt. And most of all, he understood that accepting the past did not mean letting it define him. It was the presence of Sophie and Daniel that helped him realize that, helping him move forward on the path of finding peace in his soul. And so, Richard's life turned to a new chapter. Not a spotless blank page, but a new page. That is why he is willing to continue writing with hope, love, and tolerance. Sitting by the lake in the quiet, relaxing atmosphere, Richard felt a strange peace, something he had not experienced in a long time. The ducks leisurely glided across the water, leaving gentle ripples in their wake. In that quiet moment, his mind returned to all the events that had led him here, the pain, the hidden secrets, the painful revelations. But for the first time, he no longer felt burdened by the past. Instead, there was a clarity in his heart, a gradual relief. Sitting on the quiet shore of the lake, Richard took a deep breath and let his breath mingle with the waves rolling on the surface of the water. It seemed that the peace of nature, the stillness of the surrounding scenery, helped him find an escape from the overlapping thoughts of the past. He broke the silence, his voice warm. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about everything, and I've realized that holding on to anger, to pain, only makes me more miserable. I'm not sure I'll ever understand why Mom made the decisions she did. But I think it's time for us to let go of the need to find answers. Sophie listened attentively, her eyes gentle but no less dangerous. That's a big step, knowing it wasn't easy for me. Richard nodded, a small smile on his lips, a smile that reflected how much bitterness had been washed away. It's not cute, but I don't want to let the past dominate the future anymore. What I want now is to enjoy the present, to be with you and Daniel. Sophie's smile grew warmer, her eyes shining with something like gratitude. It really means a lot to me, Dad. I know it's not easy for any of us, but I think you're right. We can't change the past, but we can look forward to the future. A sense of relief spread through Richard, like the dust had been swept away from his soul. The pain was still there, but it no longer felt like such a heavy burden. He had a new purpose, something stronger. As they continued to sit by the lake, Sophie shifted slightly, her voice hesitant but hopeful. Dad, I've thought a lot about Daniel. He'll need people to love him and care for him, and if you want, you can be an important part of his life. Richard's heart softened at Sophie's words. I want to, I really do, he whispered, his voice rising. Dad, I want to be a part of your life and Daniel's life. Sophie was disheveled, tears glimmering in her eyes. I'm so glad to hear that, because I think Daniel needs someone. The words were like a cool breeze, soothing the wounds in Richard's soul. Grandpa, he repeated softly, wrapping himself in this new game, a game he had never imagined, especially after so many years of loneliness and pain. But now it had to be the most important role. I would be honored, he whispered, his voice soft. I don't know how good I'll be, but I'll try. Sophie laughed softly, her hand resting on Daniel's little leg. Just trying is enough, right? They sat there, watching Daniel giggle as the ducks flew by, and for the first time in years, Richard felt like he belonged. As time went on, Richard found his life changing in ways he never imagined. He and Sophie grew closer, navigating the challenges of their complicated relationship with honesty and presence. There were still moments of tension, unanswered questions between them, but they were learning to face the difficulties together. Richard grew closer to Daniel, too. He found himself looking forward to the moments he had with the boy, whether it was taking Daniel to the park, reading him stories, or simply watching him explore the world with wide, curious eyes. It was a new joy, a happiness that Richard never thought he could feel. And through it all, Richard learned to let go of the anger and bitterness that consumed him. He accepted that he would never have all the answers about Emily, that some things were best left in the past. What mattered now was the future, the life he was building with Sophie and Daniel, the family he was finding. Thriving, Richard sat alone, reflecting on the past months. The pain, the loss, all of it had made him the man he was today. While time might fade many things, the memories remained. He knew he could not forget them all, but he learned not to let the past control his heart and soul. One afternoon later, as the sun was setting, Sophie and Richard walked around the lake. The golden sunset illuminated their faces. Daniel babbled a few silly words, looking at his grandfather curiously, and with a hint of childish admiration. Richard smiled, a smile that contained a peaceful, gentle but profound feeling. Sophie gently hugged her father's arm, her voice softly echoing in the quiet of the afternoon. I think we've both found our own peace, Dad. Richard looked into his daughter's eyes, feeling the deep understanding and connection between them. Yes, that's right. We've finally found what we've been looking for. In that moment, Richard realized that happiness is not something big, but sometimes it is simply being with the people you love, and knowing that no matter what the past is, they will always be there, walking together on the road ahead. In his apartment, Richard sat quietly by the window, his eyes following the brilliant picture of the city at night. The distant lights twinkled like stars in the heart of the bustling city, bringing a sense of peace but also distance. In a moment, Richard realized that everything had changed too much. Perhaps before he would feel empty and lost in this vast space. But now, the loneliness had receded, replaced by a feeling of closeness and connection that he had not felt for a long time. The presence of Sophie and Daniel in his life had changed his perspective on happiness and the future that he had never dared to hope for. He still visited Emily's grave regularly, but those visits were different from before. There was no longer a lingering sadness weighing on his heart. Instead, there were moments of contemplation and tranquility in his soul. Emily had been the deepest love of his life, and he knew that love would forever remain in his heart, an inseparable part of him. But now, every time he stood by her grave, he no longer felt remorse. He came to feel, to recall the beautiful memories, not to wallow in pain. He understood that it was time for him to let go, to make room for a new life waiting for him with Sophie and Daniel. The sun gradually set, spreading a gentle orange light across the horizon. A warm atmosphere spread throughout the small room, as if embracing Richard in a peaceful embrace. He closed his eyes, letting himself immerse himself in this rare moment of peace, a quiet satisfaction spreading from deep within his soul. This was not the life he had dreamed of, but it was a life he had gradually learned to cherish, a life he no longer wanted to avoid. It felt like little by little, he was rebuilding a belief in the future, still vague, but already glowing with hope. Recalling the time when Sophie and Daniel entered his life, Richard felt the transformation in himself was miraculous. Sophie brought him not only understanding, but also a source of vibrant energy that made him want to move forward. Daniel, with his bright eyes and mischievous smile, revived in him memories of a life full of joy and hope. Richard wondered if it was Emily, from somewhere far away, who sent them to him to fill the void she left behind. One afternoon, Richard, Sophie, and Daniel visited a small roadside cafe. They laughed and talked together, sharing simple but warm daily stories. Richard realized that there were simple but genuine joys that made him feel like he was reliving the early days of his youth. He looked at Sophie, her eyes bright, warm, and full of love. She wasn't trying to replace Emily, but gradually became an indispensable part of his life. "What are you thinking about?" Dad, Sophie suddenly asked, pulling him out of his thoughts. He smiled, his eyes gentle. Dad was just thinking that. Maybe he found something very special that he didn't think he would have before. Sophie smiled back, her gaze full of sympathy and understanding. She gently took his hand, squeezing it lightly as an affirmation. That was the moment Richard felt he was no longer alone, that he really had a new family, although not perfect but full of love. The three of them walked out of the cafe together. The afternoon light dyed a brilliant orange-pink color throughout the space. On the small path leading home, Daniel ran around, occasionally turning back to hold Richard's hand, eagerly sharing stories about school, about new friends. Richard looked at the boy with pride rising in his heart. He realized that he was not only living a different life, but also becoming a father, a role he never thought he would take on. That evening, after putting Daniel to bed, Richard stood silently by the window, watching the city under the sparkling lights. He thought about Emily, about the memories they had built together. But now, in him, there was nothing. It was no longer regret, but gratitude. Emily had given him the deepest love, and now, thanks to her, he had learned to open his heart to receive love from others. "Emily, I can let go," he whispered softly, like a gentle goodbye. "Thank you for everything, and may you rest in peace." Richard's eyes closed, silent in the final moment of separation. Each gentle breath became deeper, blending into the quiet space of the room. Richard knew that ahead of him was an unpredictable future, but at least now he had the courage to move on, to build a new life that he truly cherished. Sophie and Daniel had become his new source of life, a reason for him to continue trying every day. Night fell, covering the city with a mysterious black curtain. Richard stood there for a long time, looking deep into the darkness. Even though ahead, whatever it is, he believes he will get through it, because he is no longer alone. He has found peace within himself, a peace that he knows will not be easily lost.